You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Here in the White House.
This is crack cocaine from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or TCP. It's as innocent looking as can be.
Good evening. This is Mae Bressel in Carmel, California.
Anybody that's not willing to change based on what they learn is ignorant.
Coffee's for closers only.
I think we're giving it enough.
Go on to Chicago and let's win there.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick.
Hi, this is author Douglas Horn. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and those textbook conglomerates that still control information today.
That was the lead-in to the Midnight Rider News Show, a radio show hosted by St. Patrick, and St. is our guest today here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. In addition to being the host of the Midnight Rider News Show, St. Patrick is also a regular writer and on the board of editors for the American Free Press. He's also a regular contributor to our sponsor, the Barnes Review magazine, and he has recently launched his very own magazine, a brand new magazine that is called The Deep Truth Journal. And I just finished reading it. It's 140 pages. It is a very heavy magazine, very thick magazine, not just in its size and its content, but also it's heavy reading. It's not light reading. This is some really deep stuff here, and that's probably why they call it the Deep Truth Journal. Anyways, St. is going to be our guest today here on the show, and so St. Patrick, welcome to the Dixie Heritage Hour.
I'm well, Ed. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. You know, I want to talk about the magazine and everything, but before I do, just kind of by way of introduction for our listeners, of course, you've been one of the editors and writers at the American Free Press for a number of years, and you're also the editor-in-chief of a news service called Midnight Rider News. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, Midnight Rider News started about 2 to 2.5 years ago. And what I, in essence, wanted to do was, I was always a big podcast fan. I was always a big talk radio fan. They didn't always ask the questions that I wanted to ask. So the way to resolve that always is to have your own show. And I've been able to talk to who I would read and who I would buy at stores and who I think are the leading experts in these fields. And they are sort of what I would call alternative historical fields, alternative to the mainstream, not alternative to actual truth and facts. We're up to approximately 112 episodes of Midnight Rider News right now, which you can hear for free at midnightridernews.com. And writer is spelled with a T, like someone who writes. That's why we started that. And I sort of got in with the AFP because it's actually an interesting story. I was actually wanting to interview some of the writers there. And so I sent them a link to the show and to all the articles that I had written on the site. And they basically said, hey, why don't you come and write for us? We kind of like what you do. So I did. And it's gone really, really well with the AFP. I really enjoyed my time there. I really like the topics that I'm able to write about. And I tell this to everyone all the time. No matter what you might think about what they do, they have never one time told me, we need you to take that perspective on a story. We need you to do this. They always allow me to write it as I want to write it. It's been a blessing.
You know, I don't know how many of your articles I've read just in the last year or so there in AFP, and I've always enjoyed them. You know, last year I wrote a lot more for AFP than I have this year, mainly just because I had more time last year. Yeah, it's probably the only newspaper in America that's not in some way, shape, or form beholden, to somebody.
Exactly. And what happened was, I think what I do is I think I really do try to take a nonpartisan perspective in my articles. And I think someone would be really challenged to try to find a partisan perspective in my articles, because I really do think the two-party monopoly at this point are two sides of the same coin, per se. And I see problems in them both. However, I do have an ideology, and I do have an ideology that I believe is correct. So what we're trying to do, I think, with AFP, as you know, is I think we're trying to tell people what's really happening in the world to try to give them a perspective that they don't get in the mainstream media.
Well, I think what happened, and I think maybe one of the reasons why AFP has been able to stay out of kind of the trap, if you will, that all the other publications eventually fall into, is because even if a publication does not intend to sell out per se, or even if a publication is not intending just to be a hack for, an ideology, be it left or right or whatever, I think what happens is as you take on more and more advertisers, you become beholden to them whether you realize it or not, even if that is simply nothing more than you just don't want to offend, a corporate advertiser who's spending a lot of money to, advertise in your publication.
Right.
And I think that tempers maybe what you write and how you edit things. Even if you're not just looking to outright fabricate stories, which I'm just going to say it in the major networks, that's what they do. They fabricate stories.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you're not looking to do that, I think that you're like, well, I don't know if we want to say that because, it might offend Google and they're a big advertiser, or it might offend Procter and Gamble and it's a big advertiser, or, Congressman so-and-so I know is a really good friend with whoever's the CEO of the company that just wrote $1 million and some dollar check to advertise in your next however many issues. And so you just kind of let things slide a little bit. And AFP doesn't have that burden because we don't have any big money advertisers.
That's right. It's interesting that you say that as well, because I also taught high school history for 10 years. And that's what I was doing before I did all of what I'm doing now for about a third of the pay of being a high school teacher. And what I discovered when you teach history is that everybody always talks about classroom bias. It's one of the main things that you have to answer in the public is about your bias, your bias, your bias. And what I say all the time is I think that the real bias, and this also goes to mainstream media as well, I think the real bias is not how you cover a story in class or in a paper. The real bias is what you decide not to cover. And by the things that you leave out, that's the real bias. That's what's really happening. When you leave out what I would call key stories or key people or key topics in the mainstream media, as you just explained, because of your advertisers, I think that's the real bias that's happening.
You've said a little bit about how you were a high school history teacher, and of course, we've talked about how you've written for the Midnight Rider News Service and the American Free Press. Just kind of give us a little bit of your credentials journalistically.
Well, when I was in college in Missouri, I decided that I was going to be a journalist when I was 18 years old. So I went into journalism, and I was a semester from graduating with a BA in mass comm with a specialty in journalism. And what ended up happening was I had decided at that point that do I really want to write for my entire life about the local Elks meeting? Do I really want to write about the fireman who got the cat out of the tree? And I didn't want to do that at all. I have no desire to do that. I wanted to write about big, important things. And I wanted to write about history. I wanted to write about politics. So being a semester away, I went ahead and got the BA, and I went into education for 2 more years. So I have a BA in journalism, I have a BS in education, and I have a minor in poli-sci, in politics. And but I went into education, and I didn't go into journalism, though I would always sort of write on the side. And about 10 years after being in education, I loved education. I loved the classroom environment. I loved everything about it, especially in high schools. It is not as bad as everybody makes it sound right now. The kids are actually fantastic, or they were at that time, 3 or 4 years ago. So what I decided, though, was if I was ever going to sort of follow the dream of working at a paper and working on my own magazine and working on my own show and my own website. I was going to have to do it now while I was still at an age where I could. I was actually trained in journalism and education, and so I did spend 10 years in education, and I'm now focusing almost exclusively on journalism.
As I'm looking here at this first issue of the Deep Truth Journal, and obviously a lot of these articles, especially when they're dealing with things that happened many years ago, like the JFK assassination, not the kind of thing that would be written, say, in a regular issue of the American Free Press, which is dealing more with current news and events, as opposed to just, say, writing an article and putting it in the Barnes Review. Why come out with a whole new magazine?
Well, I think what we also wanted to do, and I think the Barnes Review does a fine job in what the Barnes Review is doing. I think Paul is excellent. And I think all the writers really work hard. And
by the way, I'm going to guess by looking at this magazine that Paul was your graphic designer?
Yes, Paul designed that issue. Yes, he did. And he did a fine job with it, by the way, as well. He's excellent. He's just absolutely so talented. But what we really wanted to do was, I knew a lot of the people in the JFK world. I know a lot of the people in the Watergate research world. And those are my sort of two topics that I enjoy the most. But what we were doing was, I hate the word pro-conspiracy. I don't like the phrase at all. What we wanted to sort of do was tell these stories from a pro-conspiratorial perspective, but from people who absolutely view it from an academic standpoint and from some of the most popular writers in the field. Sometimes I think you have to start a new magazine to sort of have that perspective come across. There's no one in that magazine, in the first issue of Deep Truth Journal, there's no one who I can say comes into it with some sort of partisan bias either. They absolutely have been on the case. Almost everyone who wrote for issue 1 has been on the case of the topic that they write about for at least 20 years. So you're talking about experts in the field as well.
Right. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. One of the first articles, at least the first one that really caught my attention, was written by Joseph Green, and it was Why the State Hates Conspiracy.
Yes. Joe's fantastic.
Well, kind of explain that a little bit. Why is it that the government is and the mainstream media and the establishment, if you will, is so anti-conspiracy, besides the obvious that it's because they're the conspirators, but...
Well, that's actually a fantastic answer, to be honest with you, Ed. What Joe is basically explaining there, and Joe Green is fantastic, very smart guy who really sort of sees things outside the box, which I love about him. What he's basically explaining there is that you have all these stories where the mainstream media and the state are more than happy to say, well, that was a conspiracy. It was a conspiracy of terrorists to bring down the towers. It was a conspiracy of Putin and Roger Stone and Manafort and Jerome Corsi to bring down Hillary. They're more than happy to say that. But why do they blatantly ignore other stories that are conspiratorial as well? And Joe uses a few examples in the article, and I think what he does well is questioning the whole idea without specifically having an answer, because it's an ongoing problem. What he's basically discussing is the idea that how do they get to decide what is a valid conspiracy and what isn't?
You know, one thing that I've noticed, and I called him on it, and he won't respond to me, is I can remember back in the 80s and even in the early 90s, Rush Limbaugh had what he called the kook test. And, of course, if you believed that there was a global conspiracy, then you failed the kook test. But yet, I don't think that a day goes by or has gone by for the last 3 years on his program when he is not talking about, even, rebuking the globalists.
Exactly.
And so I've asked him, I said, so does this mean that you're now a kook?
Right.
I guess we weren't supposed to catch that Limbaugh went from, berating those of us who believed in these conspiracy theories to, having, realized that they were truthful.
Well, I think what happened too is that you started in the 80s and 90s, especially, you started to see all these multimedia companies and these media and entertainment companies all sort of merge and buy each other out. And so when your entire media, the thing that you intake the most, when your entire media is owned by 5 to 8 corporations, how can you say it's not a conspiracy of a few, that it's not a massive oligarchy?
One of the questions that I always had regarding the Kennedy assassination, there were just certain people who, they were in Dallas that day. Like, for example, Richard Nixon was in Dallas that day. George H.W. Bush was in Dallas that day. And, why they were even there and why they were there at that time, the things that brought them there, it was, begs the question, were they brought there on purpose and so forth. And I've often wondered if this wasn't some kind of a political initiation rite for these men, being there and being made to witness this assassination. And on page 19, you talk about Bill Moyers and how Bill Moyers has his own set of deep, dark secrets regarding the Kennedy assassination, which makes me wonder, was the Kennedy assassination not just a initiation rite, if you will, for people who were going to hold high office in this country, but maybe it was also an initiation rite for those who were going to be the leaders in mainstream media as well?
I think it is sort of, it's a telling tale. And, you always have that story of every time someone comes into the White House, they have their opening meetings, and then a few guys walk in the door, and they come in, and they shut the door and say, okay, now before you do anything, let us show you a tape of this. And it's sort of the real tape of Dallas. And that, sure, that probably doesn't happen. But the point is still made. The point is still there. Now, why you have so many people in Dallas on the same day, it's boggling. And you'll find, the JFK community is very fractured. It's like any other one. It's very fractured, and there are so many arguments, whether LBJ was involved, or at what point he was involved. We're still arguing over 12 to 20 people who could have shot or could not have shot, or why they were there, or why they weren't there. If you look at New York or Los Angeles or Chicago on any day of the week in any year, you could probably make a pretty good list of names of who's in the town at that point. Does that mean that they're involved in whatever happens in that town on that day at that point? We don't know. So what we've done over the years, and this is actually what the JFK world is really good at, is that we have sort of tried to interview everyone who even had a remote interest in what happened in Dallas that day, or were even anywhere near the scene. And we have so much documentation that we can sort of now peruse through that and the files that have also been released the last 2 years, or I should say partially released the last 2 years. We can sort of peruse everything that we have. But as far as answering why, I think it being a right is not a bad answer. I also think Vietnam was sort of the immediate factor there. It's a high dollar war, or it ended up being a high dollar war, and a point needed to be made, and a point was made in Dallas.
It's really not something that I saw covered in the magazine, but I'm just curious because he's talked about it here on the show before. And, of course, I know you know Pat Shannon.
Yes.
And what do you think about his theory that there were two Oswalds?
I haven't read Pat's work on the two Oswalds, but I have read John Armstrong's. And John Armstrong has also been doing this for quite a while. And while his theory, if you heard his theory for 5 minutes, you would think, there's no way. That's just crazy. But when you get into, I think Armstrong's work is 800 or 900 pages. It's massive. It's a massive tome. When you really get into it, it seems more and more possible the more you read into it and the more he explains it. Obviously, they were using multiple patsies. I think that's pretty clear. If something went wrong with Oswald that day, I do believe there was absolutely a backup at some point. And Oswald had to have a backstory. And if Lee Harvey Oswald was not going to provide his own backstory, then the CIA, who had a 201 file on Oswald 2 years before Dallas. So the CIA had already had a file for multiple years, and the FBI had already been on Oswald's trail for a while as well. Is it possible that you might have had a Harvey Oswald and a Lee Oswald? Yes, I absolutely do believe that's a possibility.
To kind of change things up a little bit, August 1941, the key to understanding FDR's design for American entry into World War II.
That article is written by Douglas Horne, who was actually on the ARRB, which was set up by the JFK Act in 1992 to go through the documents. After Oliver Stone's JFK had come out in 1991, there was a big push to release the documents. And so the government set up the ARRB as a board to sort of go through those documents. Well, Doug Horne was actually on that board. And so he's written a 5-volume set about JFK and the documents. But a couple of years ago, he also became extremely interested in the topic of Pearl Harbor. And so he's written a pretty large 2-volume set on Pearl Harbor as well. And he believes FDR absolutely had foreknowledge. At the very least, we now have a document which you can see a few pages after that. It takes up the entire page. We now have a document from the Japanese ambassador to Berlin to the Tokyo office, stating that he was told that if the Japanese get into a conflict with the U.S., that Germany would come into the war and declare war on the U.S. So his whole idea, what Horne shows, I think, technically and perfectly throughout this long article, is that FDR absolutely had a desire to get into the war with the Germans. And so he sort of used the Japanese. He sort of drew the Japanese into Pearl Harbor as a means by which to get into the war in Europe. And that document, I think, is proof that that's the case. Now, that document was found for the first time about 35 years ago. It was just sort of rediscovered a few years back, and I think it's vital in the understanding of the Pearl Harbor story.
And so then after that, of course, you jump to a very recent conspiracy, and that was July 10th, 2016, with the murder of Seth Rich.
Well, that's interesting. We definitely wanted to have a couple stories in there that we felt like were somewhat modern, because we wanted to show that things are still occurring, that things are still happening. Now, the Rich story fascinates me. The reason it does is because the whole Russiagate story seems like it's falling apart. And let me remind everyone what the Russiagate story is. Russiagate started as this, that the Trump campaign colluded with Russian hackers to steal DNC emails for the purpose of winning the 2016 presidential race. If you can prove that those things are not true, that any of those things are not true, that the Trump campaign did not collude with Russian hackers to steal DNC emails, you basically have no story. And so you can't sort of expand the story. You can't sort of widen the net to make a story. That's the story. And if that story isn't true, you have no story. So then when Rich gets murdered, especially, he worked in technology at the DNC, and he was not a Hillary supporter at all. He was a Bernie Sanders supporter. There is good reason to think that Rich is the one who leaked the DNC emails to Julian Assange and his people, and therefore he was killed because of it. A lot of the mainstream media does not want to believe that. But as you can see in the article, when someone goes through it, and they should, you should absolutely buy this magazine, because the amount of information contained within its covers is amazing. There are hardly no ads and a lot of content. So when you go through and read all of the perspectives, and that's what we decided to do with that one, it's laid out unlike the others in that we sort of take pieces of the story and explain all of these pieces from all of these angles. And you can see that there's a much more important story in the Rich murder rather than the idea that the Trump campaign colluded with Russian hackers to steal the emails.
When you're dealing with something like, say, the Kennedy assassination, and obviously here just recently, President Trump basically could have opened up all of those files, and instead he chose to reseal them. And I'm not for sure why he did that. Obviously, probably because there was something in there that would embarrass somebody that he didn't want to see embarrassed. You know, George W. Bush could be embarrassed, or his brother or somebody in their family could be embarrassed if those files reveal that his father had more than a observers or eyewitnesses involvement to that assassination. The same with President Nixon's family, and some people who are still politically associated with Nixon may find it embarrassing to find out that, you know, if he had an involvement there. You know, Ted Cruz potentially could be embarrassed by something if his father was involved in the assassination, like was implied during the presidential debates in 2016 and so forth. But all of the people who are probably indictable in the matter are dead. But when you get into something more current like the Seth Rich murder, the people who did that are very much alive.
Oh, yeah.
And so the closer you get to living people, I'm sure the more blowback you're going to get by exposing these things. I mean, and the more...
Yes.
The more, is persecution the right word to say that you're subjecting yourself and your publication to by doing it?
I would say yes over the long run. In the short run, I think their first response is always mockery. I think the first thing that they try to do is to call you a conspiracist, a conspiracy theorist, a wacko, a kook, as you explained earlier. I think the first thing they try to do is laugh it off. I just don't think that the public is that dumb anymore. I think they've gone through so many years of seeing so many of these stories. They just aren't buying the fact that it's laughable, that, well, the media is always right. Yes, over time, the more stories that we do like this, the more in danger we are. I think there's a value to being very public with this. I think there's a value to speaking out. I think there's a value to attaching your name and your brand on something, in that if something did ever happen to you, you're not sort of someone in the shadows. Now you're public, and now there's more to explain. So am I worried about danger? No. But I also don't enjoy the mockery either. But that comes along with it, and we all know that. We all know that from the beginning. But everything that we found in the magazine, which is so why it, that's the reason why we use endnotes, and that's the reason why we require the writers who are going to do longer articles to supply endnotes with their pieces as well, because we definitely want everyone out there to be able to go check the sources.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed, and that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
You know, another person that you hit on who is still a living person and who is still very much active in the political goings-on in the world. You know, he still attends the Bilderberger meetings, and was it, I believe, Barack Obama, it was said, got a telephone call from him almost every day. And that is Henry Kissinger.
Oh, yes.
And, of course, Kissinger has even made some visits to the Trump White House. You state that Jim Angleton of the CIA had actually believed that when he was Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger was a Soviet agent, and obviously that was covered up.
Well, Angleton's interesting himself. There have been a few recent works about Angleton that are both very good. What I would say about Angleton was he's a bit of an enigma himself. He was always on this hunt to rat out a mole in the agency. A lot of people think the mole happened to be Jim Angleton. You never really knew what he was doing or why, but he was sort of the counter-espionage guy for the agency for many years, had his hand in almost everything. When the Church Committee took a deeper look at the CIA, Angleton was one of those guys sort of most heavily under the microscope. I would point people, if they want to know more about Angleton, we are going to have more in the magazine in future issues to come, but there have also been a few really good recent biographies as well. Now, was Kissinger an agent? I would say no. I would say that he never needed to be. Not that he wouldn't have been. I would say that he never needed to be. I've always found him to be a person very much interested in his own doings. I don't think that he would have been an agent of any country, bad or good.
Of course, in that article, a greater context to that was the fact that getting Nixon out of office, it was the first time that our country had, anything close to a coup d'etat.
Yes.
And we're seeing the exact same thing happen against President Trump. So having a Secretary of State in the Nixon administration who had ties to Russia, and now, of course, the whole Trump-Russia collusion angle in the current coup d'etat. It's almost as if the liberals took the same script and just changed a few names, maybe kicking up their accusations a notch. But it's almost as if they weren't creative enough to come up with a new game plan.
Well, I'm trying to understand what a tie is. So I guess we can start there with this. The world is a smaller place at this point, is it not? And if you're going to run a corporation of some kind, I mean, technically, someone in Russia can buy the AFP. It can buy our magazine now. It can hear our podcast, and it does. I mean, you can go on and see the statistics, and hundreds of people there hear each episode of our podcast. So what does that mean? Now, does that mean that we have ties to Russia? Or what does that mean exactly? If you're an international capitalist of some kind, you're bound to have ties with everyone that you could possibly have ties with, and you want to open up markets. So I'm not sure what ties are at this point. If ties mean spying, then yes, I would obviously think that's against the law. But when they say ties, I think that's a bit ambiguous for any administration. But what I find interesting about this, too, is sort of how the Cold War has sort of been turned on its head, in a sense that I think both sides of this are backwards from what they were in the Cold War. You have the right now who's actually saying, you know what, the Russians can be right, and they can be good, and they can be this, and you guys are way too paranoid about the Russians. Now, imagine that in 1980, imagine that in the LBJ years. Imagine that right after Eisenhower was in office. But then you have the left who are saying, well, the Russians are the enemy. And it was the left, and look, I'm no Mitt Romney fan, not at all. But when Romney said during the campaign that he thinks that the Russians are actually the enemy at this point still, everybody laughed at him. And now the left is agreeing with that. It's like the Cold War politics have been sort of turned on their head on both sides of the spectrum. And it's not something that I'm understanding completely yet, except that it seems like each side is in essence trying to use it. But they're still pitting us against each other in a means by which to stay in power. And again, two sides of the same coin, it only protects those who are in power. And that's bothered me now for over 20 years. In college, I was a jacket and tie Republican. I was Michael J. Fox, right? I had on the small tie. I had the perfect part in the hair. I went to all the meetings. And then Waco happened. I'm in my dorm room, and I'm watching Waco unfold on television. And I think it was April of '93. I'm watching it unfold, and then I look more and more into it, and I'm seeing what we're saying about Waco. And then Oklahoma happens a year later. And the Weavers had actually been killed a year before Waco. I just really started to become anti-party. And then I can remember it was 1996, I think it was. And there were so many reasons for the Republicans to win. And they nominate Bob Dole. And I sat back and I said, I'm done with this. I'm done with this partisan monopoly that we have telling me who I have to support. And if the Republicans are the challengers, they will constantly tell you, look, if you don't support us, you're supporting who's in the White House. And then the left will tell you, if you don't support us, you're supporting who's in the White House. And meanwhile, they're basically badgering you and scaring you into having to support the party that they want you to support. And instead, no one's talking about a valid, viable third party here. And they should be, because the two-party monopoly is a sham. And I think we have to get away from that. But I also think we have to get away from that historically as well. And in the magazine, in Deep Truth Journal, that's in essence what we're trying to get away from as well. How can we find the truth of what happened, but not come about it from a partisan angle at all, because the two-party monopoly is a monopoly.
Well, you talk about 1996. I was one of the managers at the RNC's National Phone Bank in Houston, Texas in 1996. And when Pat Buchanan swept the first 5 primaries and caucuses, I mean, hands down, he cleared the table on them. And not only did he clear the table in the Republican primaries and caucuses, he got more write-in votes in the Democrat primaries and caucuses than Bill Clinton received balloted votes in the same. So here was somebody who had an appeal in both parties. In other words, somebody who should be easily electable in a general election against an unpopular and controversial and scandal-ridden president.
Right.
I remember the leadership of the RNC was telling us all the things that we had to start doing to basically make sure that Pat Buchanan was done. And I remember basically saying, not only is this unethical, not only does it violate several of the rules of our own party, we're also violating federal election law here. And their response to that was they just fired me because, obviously I wasn't going to get behind, the man who was Bob Dole. What was even funnier was they brought in, and this is what happened. there were a number of people who did not want to go along with this. And we were all replaced with Democrat operatives. In other words, they called over to the DNC and they brought over people to replace us. And so the people running the phone bank and the people running the surveys and the people who were doing a lot of the legwork within the RNC, the paid employees, they weren't even Republicans. They were Democrats who agreed to take the job because they knew that Bob Dole was unelectable and would guarantee Bill Clinton's reelection. A couple of them, as I was kind of clearing out, one of them even told me, he said, you just have to understand, he said, sometimes we cut deals. The RNC is giving us this election, he said, but don't worry, we'll pay it back. You get the next one.
I mean, listen, Ed, please tell me that you never backed the RNC again or the candidates.
I never did until Trump ran.
Good. Well, no, I think that's good because I think 4 years later, it's like we all forget, and it's 4 years later, and then Sean Hannity. I'll be honest, I am no Sean Hannity fan because I think he's a lightweight, but he is point number one of trying to scare the Republicans into supporting Republicans. And he always will pull it's the most consequential race in our lifetime. But it has been every year since 92. When is it not? And then the Republicans will say, well, I've got to vote for this one. I don't like this one because I can't support Obama again. I can't support Bill Clinton again. And then Alan Colmes of the world will tell his people, well, you can't support Trump again. It's the most consequential race in our lifetime. It's going to be again in 4 years. I promise you that. And then 4 years after that. And then 4 years after that. What happens where we as the American people finally stand up and say, look, neither of these parties are supportive of us. Why are we supportive of them?
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. On page 64, you have an article on Jim Garrison. Without necessarily spending a lot of time here, I'm just going to ask the question this way. The movie JFK starring Kevin Costner. Did Kevin Costner nail Jim Garrison in the trial, or do people just need to read William Davies' work because the movie got it all wrong?
I think he nailed him. I think the movie is fantastic. You know, the thing that happened is the mainstream media was starting to bash JFK and Oliver Stone before the movie even came out, before they had seen the movie. What Oliver Stone, I think the best thing that he did was he published a book that you can still buy on Amazon. It is the entire script, and it's all annotated. And so he's got references and he's got links for the entire script. And you can see where he got all of the information. I think that movie is fantastic. What I think that article does, though, is explain a little bit more of what was happening behind the scenes. And some things that you just, even though JFK runs approximately 3.5 hours, there's still just not enough time to explain some of the details. And what that article does is explain some of the details, and I think adds to the story in a way that makes you really appreciate Jim Garrison much more.
One of the implications, of course, in the whole Garrison story, if you will, is that the CIA was very involved in the assassination of JFK.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, the CIA seems to pop up as a player in a lot of, I'll just call them conspiracies. And on, let's see, page 86, you have an article here about how not only is fake news a real thing and a real problem, but that the CIA is the manufacturer of the fake news, I guess, to cover their own tracks and their own conspiracies.
Yes, I think the first time that we really knew that that was a fact, Watergate journalist Carl Bernstein wrote the article for Rolling Stone magazine, and it basically said at any time there are close to 400 to 500 journalists in modern mainstream journalism who are absolutely working for or with or in conjunction with the CIA. And for Carl Bernstein to come out and say that in Rolling Stone just a few years after Watergate, I think was very important. But we also know that, you know, multiple magazines, Time, Life, Reader's Digest, the agency was always heavily involved.
So I don't know about you, but I'm guessing that my writing just must not be up to snuff, or they must just be overstaffed or something, because, you know, they've never called me to offer the big paycheck to write the fake news.
No, me either. But I'm guessing we don't quite have the readership that you know, the Washington Post might have. I think the Washington Post especially is almost home base, you know, for the agency. I really do. Always has been.
Right. So does that mean that Jeff Bezos is really a CIA operative?
Let's just say I have no evidence of that. But I think when you get to a certain point, if you don't cooperate, I think you'll have more problems.
Right. Well, of course, you know, the CIA doesn't always call them officers or operatives, you know, but they will call them assets.
Yes.
And assets are often very passive things. And so I guess it's possible to be an asset without actively doing anything. You know.
Well, the assets can also be provided access to certain things that, I mean, certain small things even, you know, especially internationally. If someone in the agency helps you secure a meeting, helps Amazon secure a meeting with someone in Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Switzerland, somewhere, a meeting that he needs to basically have to, you know, to help his own company. Has he been used as an asset, or is he just ingratiating himself at that point? And it's a tricky, murky area. I think there's always sort of a tit for tat there when that occurs. You open the doors to agency influence at that point.
And, of course, one thing that I think would be very interesting to a lot of our listeners, simply because we have so many Southerners in our listening audience, is the article that appears on Abraham Lincoln, basically that you have traced the evolution of the modern police state back to Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, well, the author of that article is Donald Jeffries, who now writes for the AFP as well. So he's an AFP journalist that everybody out there is going to recognize, and he does excellent work. And what he does, he also challenges everyone and everything in a nonpartisan way. And he's looked at Lincoln for years now, and to sort of do the anti-Lincoln story has been sort of in vogue for 20 or 30 years. And I think that's a good thing. And I say that as an Illinoisan, by the way, who is in Lincoln's home state for the most part. We were always taught in schools, you know, that Lincoln was the greatest. I can't say that he didn't do some really good things. I can't say that he didn't do some really bad things. But I think it's important. I think what Deep Truth Journal has to do is to challenge the mainstream establishment. What we're trying to do is to challenge the historical establishment and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. if we just wrote a puff piece about Abraham Lincoln, then we're basically going along with the historical establishment and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. But what he tries to do in that article is to show some of the fraud that was occurring at the time. He does draw it back. He does draw it back to Abraham Lincoln specifically, and he's about to release a new book, actually, that is going to look at some of the conspiracies that have occurred before JFK. And Lincoln, as I understand, is a big part of that book. So that's going to be interesting as well.
And then you go back to the modern, to the more current again, and there's an article by John Potash, The Democracy Illusion, Keeping Donald Trump Compliant with the Pro-War Corporate Agenda. And, you talk about how, of course, the whole deep state conspired against Bernie Sanders, conspired against Donald Trump, during the election to keep them from getting into office. But now that Trump is in office, and of course Bernie Sanders is still in the Senate, the same deep state is basically manipulating them and manipulating the whole process of our so-called democracy so that they will perpetuate the very things that they were running against and that conspired against them.
Well, absolutely. And I think John Potash has also really done a great job in explaining this. Our deep state, it has no party. It has no interest other than its own interest, its own entrenchment of power. And it goes after people in both parties as well. And what we basically saw was Trump being sort of fighting it during the whole campaign, and popularly fighting it the whole campaign, that made him almost a populist rather than being a Republican. But his appointments while he's been in office, to me, have been troubling almost the entire way through. It's hard to believe that they have not been chosen, or at least, I guess, influenced by the deep state to some point. And so we have to wonder at this point, is Trump really fighting them, or is he complying? And I've heard some people speculate that what the deep state really wanted is Mike Pence, was to have Mike Pence in power. And the way to do that is to somehow get Trump into the White House and then bring him down after he is. That would be the way to get Pence in power, because Pence could never have won by himself. And you can see this the whole way through. You could see this in 1980. Reagan, he defeats Carter, and 2 months after, he ends up shot. You can see this with JFK. You can see this all the way down the line. Some might even say also you can see this with Dwight Eisenhower. Who they get into power is not necessarily who they want in power. And I think that's the point that John Potash is also trying to make.
Well, that begs another question then, because Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president.
Exactly.
So why did they want Nixon in power and then wanted him out of power? I mean, obviously Nixon.
Well, I think he was going to. I think they absolutely believed, especially after the Alger Hiss case and all of that, that he was going to be an all-star of the deep state. And then more than anyone in the 1900s, I think he gets into power and he fights the deep state. I think that was very surprising, to be honest with you. Very surprising to them, and something that was not going to be stood for and not be allowed.
Toward the end of the magazine, you talk about no safe space for professors, and this was an article that you had written, and you talk about several university professors and teachers around the country who have been fired simply for daring to tell the truth to their students and kind of let them look behind the curtain on some of these news stories and see the conspiratorial aspects of them.
Yeah, being a teacher for 10 years, I was able to sort of see what actually happens behind the scenes, not in a college, but, in a high school. And I taught in public high schools. I taught in private high schools. I actually, the first time I saw it, I was at a Catholic high school, and I'm not Catholic. So I was at a Catholic high school teaching world history. And I was actually called into the office by two priests who wanted to discuss how I was covering Henry VIII and the Spanish Inquisition. And I explained how I saw it. And, they said, well, the church has a few problems with that perspective. And I said, well, but I think that's the accurate perspective, and I really do want to stay with that. And that was my last year at that Catholic school by my choice.
Right.
And so, but on college campuses, which are supposed to be the marketplaces of ideas all across the spectrum, the marketplace of ideas where free thought is supposed to be appreciated, you have these instructors on both ends of the political spectrum who are being fired for what they say or what they talk about or what they believe. In every case I talked about in the article, I believe it's been wrong. I don't care if the person is what side of the spectrum he or she's on. It matters not.
Well, the magazine that you've put out here, the Deep Truth Journal, it's 140 pages, so it is not a light magazine.
No, it is not. And we definitely wanted, what we told the writers was, the very least we would like to go on the full-length features are 3,000 words. That's the least. I think the Jim Garrison article tops out at around 8,000 words. So we absolutely wanted the readers to get value. We also want this to be a magazine that people can put on their bookshelves and come back to year after year, as if it's a book, as if it's a small book. And Paul has done a great job on the art. Paul did a great job on the design. Absolutely fantastic. And so I do think it's not a magazine that you're just going to buy, read through one time, and then throw it in trash. It is absolutely one to have on the bookshelf for years to come.
So how does one subscribe to the Deep Truth Journal?
Well, we aren't doing subscriptions right now because subscriptions are very hard to keep track of. And we didn't know how it would do, to be honest with you, but it's done very well, I hear. We're actually working on issue 2 right now. You can go to the AFP website, AmericanFreePress.net, and then hit the store tab, and you can buy Deep Truth Journal there. We also have it up on Alibris.com. That's ALIBRIS.com, where you can also search for Deep Truth Journal there. And if anybody has any questions out there and would like to know how they could order it or they didn't have a chance to write this down, you can also email me personally at deeptruthjournal@gmail.com. And I will send you a link to buy it. And if there's anything that you'd like to ask about the magazine, I can do that as well.
Okay, so is there anything about the magazine that you want to let us know that maybe I didn't think to ask about? Or
not really. I think we covered it very well. I think if what you're expecting is a part 2 of the Barnes review, I don't think that's what the magazine is. I think we cover other topics. What I tried to do is to gather writers from all across the spectrum who are just really respected in their fields. And the Barnes Review does a really good job of covering certain aspects of our history that are usually not covered at all. But I think Deep Truth Journal is its own magazine.
So when does your next issue come out?
What we're doing right now is we're gathering the work. It is my guess probably 2 to 3 months. The issue 1, the inaugural issue, is really doing well right now, but we just started to publicize it in the AFP, I think 2 or 3 issues ago. We're going to allow it a little bit of space to sort of permeate out into the readership. Then we're going to come out with issue 2, which I have a feeling is also going to be fantastic.
So is it still your goal to have 2 issues of the magazine per year?
Obviously, if it sold extremely well, we would probably try to do it more often. But it's a pretty thick magazine. It's a pretty big job. With having everybody writing longer articles, which everybody's doing research on those articles as well. Believe me, nobody's just writing them off the top of their head. You can read the endnotes at the end of each piece. They're all very well documented, but it does take time. So right now, yes, we are looking at twice a year. But hey, Ed, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and cut you off there because we are out of time. But I want to thank you for being our guest today. And also, I want to encourage our listeners, of course, to visit your website, the Midnight Rider News website, and also go to the Deep Truth Journal website. You can look both of those up on Google, Bing, or your favorite search engine. Go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net. I'd love to send you a free copy of my book, love to send you a free copy of my newsletter, no cost or obligation. So until next week, from all of us here at TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless.